Welcome to Threads of Truth, the podcast where real-life mysteries meet internet speculation. Today, we are walking through one of the strangest and, frankly, most unsettling real-life mysteries to emerge from Australia in the last decade.
You're talking about the Tromp family case, I assume, from August 2016?
Exactly, the terrifying fate of the Tromp family. Our mission today is, well, to unpack the sources surrounding this event, try to structure a thorough understanding of their bizarre six-day scattering,
And weigh the official psychological conclusion against all those other theories, the ones that really caught the public imagination.
Yeah, it's a story that it defies easy explanation, doesn't it? Mostly because the trigger, the catalyst for the whole thing seems to have been entirely internal.
It really does. Yeah, Mark and Jacoba Tromp, they were successful berry farmers, seemed perfectly normal, and their 3 adult children, Rihanna, Mitchell, and Ella, living this, peaceful, apparently prosperous life on their farm in Sylvan, Victoria.
Until just out of the blue, that reality completely fractured.
Fractured is putting it mildly. It shattered.
Because on August 29th, 2016, the entire family, all 5 of them, just piled into the car and drove north. They didn't just leave, they left their home unlocked. Financial paperwork apparently scattered across tables.
And crucially, this is the detail that always gets me, they abandoned every single tether to the modern world.
Phones.
Gone, left behind. Credit cards, passports, everything.
Wow.
This wasn't just packing light. This was a sudden coordinated flight. And it seems driven by this powerful shared belief, but a belief that was completely unsubstantiated.
A belief that they were being tracked or followed, that someone was trying to rob and kill them. That was the phrase used, wasn't it?
That was the phrase reported, yes. Intense, immediate danger in their minds.
So this wasn't a vacation. It wasn't even a planned escape. It was a desperate flight from an enemy that, well, by all accounts, didn't actually exist outside their shared consciousness.
Which brings us right to that central, chilling question we need to explore for you listening. What kind of acute terror, whether it's real or completely imagined, could cause an entire functioning family unit to abandon everything?
Their home, their jobs, their identities, really.
And just scatter across the Australian countryside in this state of terrified unison.
We are going to unpack the terrifying scope of their journey today and really try to analyze the psychological implications of this break from reality.
Okay, so the departure itself, August 29th, 2016, that was the starting gun for the chaos that followed.
They drive immediately north, right, from Sylvan in Victoria, heading up towards New South Wales, covering huge distances from the get-go.
Exactly. And the sources, the police reports, they all confirm the motivation wasn't external. It was purely psychological.
Yeah.
A sudden collective conviction that these unnamed external forces were closing in on them.
And the intensity of that paranoia was immediate. Mitchell, he's the 25-year-old son. He later spoke briefly to the media, didn't he?
He did, yes.
And he confirmed this stunning detail early on. He had managed to sneak his phone along for the ride. Probably habit, right?
Probably just instinct for someone his age. But his parents reportedly found out. And they forced him to throw it out the car window.
Out the window. Because they believed it was a tracking device.
That single action speaks volumes, doesn't it? Yes. Forcing your adult child to destroy their link to the outside world because you genuinely believe it's being used against you. It just shows the absolute gravity, the intensity of the shared delusion they were operating under.
It's a physical act, getting rid of the perceived threat, completely cutting ties with this imagined surveillance state.
And it also gives us our first, maybe, hint about the hierarchy within this delusion.
How so?
Well, Mitchell, while he clearly went along with it initially, he was the first one to recognize just how severe his parents' state of mind was. It suggests maybe he wasn't fully consumed by the fear in the same way.
Right. He had enough perspective to see it was wrong.
Correct. Mitchell was the first one to actually separate from the group. This happened near Bathurst in New South Wales, which you have to remember is already a significant distance from their home in Sylvan.
And this was still day 1, or just into day 2.
This was day 1, August 30th. Mitchell basically realized he needed to get out, to reestablish contact with reality, you could say.
And he managed to get back home.
Yeah, he somehow found his way back to Melbourne using public transport. He effectively removed himself from that escalating delusion, that moving bubble of paranoia.
Okay, so the original group of 5 is now down to 4. Mark, the father, Jacoba, the mother, and the 2 daughters, Rihanna and Ella.
And as they traveled onward, the behavior of this remaining unit just grew. Well, increasingly erratic, secretive, defined by fear. The road itself almost seemed to accelerate the contagion.
How do you mean, like the journey fed the paranoia?
Exactly. Think about it. Lack of sleep, the high stress of constant driving, probably not eating properly, and this continuous need to justify their extreme actions to each other. It meant the fear just spiraled. It built upon itself.
A psychological feedback loop.
Precisely. And that loop reached a critical point by day 3.
Okay, day 3. This is still August 30th. What happens next?
The daughters, Rihanna, who was 29, and Ella, 22, they separated from their parents. This happened near the Jenolan Caves area. It's incredibly scenic, beautiful spot, but also quite remote.
Right. And from here, this is where it really starts to splinter, isn't it? The family members start going off in these utterly bewildering directions.
Yeah, the timeline truly dissolves into chaos here. The 2 daughters, Rihanna and Ella, they were initially traveling together after leaving their parents, but they quickly split up too.
Okay.
And Ella made one of the most jarring decisions of the entire saga. She stole a car.
Stole a car. Just hot-wired it.
Details are a bit fuzzy on the how, but she took a vehicle that wasn't hers, and then she drove that stolen car all the way back, hundreds of kilometers, back towards Melbourne.
Back towards the place they were fleeing from. That makes no sense. Why?
The stated reason, the one that came out later, is almost unbelievable in its mundanity. She went back to feed her horses.
To feed her horses. In the middle of this perceived life or death crisis, after stealing a car, she drives back into the supposed danger zone for horse feed.
It captures the core conflict of their mental state, doesn't it? The delusion was powerful enough to convince her that shadowy figures, maybe the government, were hunting them. Yet this very ordinary day-to-day responsibility of caring for her animals still held sway.
It shows a severe break from reality, but a selective one.
Exactly. One anxiety, the perceived threat, didn't completely obliterate another, the duty to her animals. It shows how the mind can fragment under extreme stress. She was later apprehended, of course, and charged with theft, which just adds another layer of chaos to her return.
Okay, so that's Ella. Stealing cars, feeding horses, facing charges. Now contrast that with her sister Rihanna. What happened to her on that same day, August 30th?
Rihanna's situation was drastically different and, frankly, terrifying. She was discovered later that day in Goulburn, New South Wales. She was hiding in the back of a stranger's utility vehicle.
A ute, as they call it in Australia. Hiding.
Yes, and her condition. The reports described her as catatonic, completely unable to communicate. She couldn't state her name, couldn't say where she was from, couldn't explain anything.
Just shut down.
Total mental collapse, it seems. Brought on by the sustained stress, the fear, the whole ordeal, she was immediately assessed by the authorities there and admitted for psychiatric care. It was clear she needed urgent help.
Good grief. So by the end of day 3, we've got Mitchell back home in Melbourne, presumably bewildered. Ella is also back, but facing charges and clearly not thinking straight. And Rihanna is hospitalized hundreds of miles away in a severe psychiatric state.
That leaves the parents, Mark and Jacoba, now truly alone, separated from all their children and still deep in that acute flight mode.
Where did they end up?
Jacoba, the mother, she was the next one found. This was on September 1st, so about 2 days after the daughters separated from them. She was discovered near Yass, also in New South Wales, but miles away from Goulburn where Rihanna was.
And her condition?
Similar state of distress. Found wandering, deeply distressed, confused. Like Rihanna, she was also immediately admitted for psychiatric treatment. It confirmed just how profound and acute this break from reality was for her too.
The whole family is just scattered across state lines, moving in directions that make no logical sense, separated by geography and, well, by this shared mental health crisis. That just leaves Mark, the father, 51 years old. He was the last piece of the puzzle.
Mark was the last one found, yes. On September 3rd, he turned up near the Wangaratta Airport back in Victoria.
Wangaratta? That's hundreds of miles from Yass where Jacoba was found and even further from Goulburn.
Exactly. Hundreds of miles away from his wife and daughters. Physically, he was apparently okay, apart from being dehydrated. Mentally, clearly distressed and disoriented.
What happened to him then? Charged? Hospitalized?
He was checked over, found to be physically okay, though clearly shaken. He was later released into the care of his brother, And Mark actually offered a public apology later on for the confusion, the worry, and the massive police resources his family's flight had consumed across multiple states.
Which brings us to the official investigation. The police had this massive search on their hands, spanning huge areas. They had to figure out what on earth happened. Did they look for foul play, external threats?
Oh, absolutely. They conducted an exhaustive investigation. They looked for any sign of an external trigger: drugs, toxins in the home or on the farm, evidence of criminal activity directed at the family, any legitimate threats.
And they found
Nothing.
Yeah.
Absolutely nothing. No drugs, no environmental toxins flagged, no evidence of any criminal plots against them, no credible external threats whatsoever.
So after all that searching, all that chaos, the conclusion was it all came from within.
That was the overwhelming professional consensus. Police, medical professionals, they concluded that the entire incident was a severe, acute mental health crisis. The diagnosis: shared psychosis, also known as folie à deux, or in this case, because it involved the whole family, folie à famille.
Madness of the family.
Essentially, yes.
So the official line is that the Tromp family somehow collectively created their own horrifying reality. A reality so powerful, so convincing to them, that it propelled them 1,600 kilometers across the country, leaving physical and emotional wreckage in their wake.
That's the conclusion, supported by the lack of any other evidence. A shared delusion took hold and drove them over the edge.
Okay, let's spend some time exploring that official explanation then. Because folie à famille, shared psychosis, it's the dominant theory, the one backed by the lack of, well, anything else concrete. What exactly is it? And why do the experts believe it fits the Trump case so perfectly?
All right, so folie à deux literally translates from French as madness of two. When it extends to more members, like a whole family, we use folie à famille, a fascinating diagnosis. But clinically, it's extremely rare.
Really rare.
Very. It describes a situation where a delusional belief originates with one person, the primary individual, or the inductor, and is then transmitted to and accepted by one or more other people who are in a close, often quite isolated, relationship with that primary person.
So the followers basically adopt the delusion as their own truth, even if it flies in the face of all external reality.
Precisely. They internalize it completely. And in the Trump case, the sources generally point towards Mark, the father, as the likely primary inductor of the shared fear.
Why him specifically?
Often, in these cases, the inductor is the person who holds the most dominant or authoritative position within that close, isolated group. They have the most psychological influence. And the nature of the fear here being tracked by technology, the government surveillance angle, leading to that very specific act of destroying the mobile phone, it suggests a dominant parental belief system was being imposed downwards.
That makes sense. And didn't the children say something about their parents' behavior afterwards?
They did. They confirmed that their parents' behavior leading up to and during the event was entirely out of character. And importantly, they attributed the initial breakdown not to some external event, but to a severe buildup of, quote, stress and pressure from everyday life, like it reached a critical point.
Sounds like the pressure cooker just blew. Like the reservoir of maybe underlying anxiety or paranoia was already full, and one single thought, maybe a simple misunderstanding or misinterpreting something innocuous,
caused it to spill over and just flood the entire family's shared consciousness.
But, and this is the big but, for many people, it still leaves that critical psychological gap. Why did it manifest so suddenly? And why did it affect the entire family unit so rapidly and so uniformly? That's the vacuum, isn't it? The space where public speculation, especially online, just rushed in.
Absolutely. The absence of a clear, definitive external cause is precisely what fuels speculation. It's profoundly unsettling for people to think that a seemingly stable, successful family could just spontaneously combust, psychologically speaking. So naturally, people search for a tangible, physical cause instead.
Okay, let's explore some of those other theories then. Even if the police dismissed them, they're a huge part of how this story was understood or misunderstood by the public. First up, the idea of financial stress. You mentioned paperwork scattered in the house.
Yes, the media reported that when police first entered the abandoned Tromp house, they noted these organized piles of financial documents left out, maybe on tables or desks.
Which immediately makes people think money problems.
Exactly. That finding became a magnet for speculation. The theory went that the paranoia wasn't random. It was rooted in very real, maybe massive financial fears, perhaps impending bankruptcy or a sudden tax audit or some kind of investigation by authorities they were terrified of.
So the flight wasn't from imagined spooks, but from the taxman or creditors.
That was the theory. The whole bizarre road trip was seen as a desperate escape from insolvency or legal trouble.
But the police didn't buy it. Why not, if the documents were right there?
Because their subsequent investigation into the Tromps' actual financial affairs suggested the opposite. The family was, by all accounts, financially successful. They ran a prosperous berry farm. They weren't drowning in debt.
So the scattered documents
Were likely part of the delusional framework, not the cause of it. Perhaps Mark, in his panic state, became convinced those specific documents were crucial, either needed by the persecutors he imagined, or maybe he scattered them in a manic attempt to hide or destroy evidence that only existed in his mind. The financial crisis was likely only real within the scope of his, and then the family's, intensifying delusion, not an external audited reality.
Okay, that makes sense. The fear creates the evidence, not the other way around. What about the second major area of speculation? The environmental or chemical exposure theories. Living on a farm, maybe pesticides or something in the house.
This is a classic go-to theory in cases of sudden, unexplained behavioral changes, especially when multiple people are affected simultaneously. Online forums, Reddit threads, armchair detectives, they really pursued the idea that some local environmental factor could have triggered the acute psychosis.
What were the main contenders?
Two main ones emerged. First, carbon monoxide poisoning. Maybe from a faulty heater, an appliance, exhaust fumes, somehow getting into their recently renovated home. CO poisoning is insidious. It can cause confusion, cognitive changes, sometimes delirium, and it would affect everyone in the house.
That sounds plausible, actually. It fits the sudden onset and multiple victims aspect.
It does seem plausible on the surface. However, the medical checks performed on the family members when they were found, while obviously focused on their immediate psychiatric needs, didn't report the kind of systemic physical symptoms or long-term damage you might expect from severe, prolonged CO exposure. There was no definitive finding pointing that way.
Okay, what was the other environmental theory?
The other one, perhaps a bit more exotic and often linked specifically to the farm setting, involved accidental ingestion of datura plant toxins.
Datura, what's that?
It's a plant, sometimes called Jimson weed or devil's trumpet. It contains potent hallucinogenic compounds, specifically tryptane alkaloids. Ingesting it, even accidentally, can cause severe, prolonged delirium, vivid and often terrifying hallucinations, both visual and auditory, and a complete break with reality.
Wow, that sounds like it could absolutely explain a sudden onset of widespread delusion and paranoia. Why was this theory ultimately dismissed by investigators?
Again, it came down to the lack of clinical evidence. If all five, or even the core four who continued the journey, had ingested a sufficient dose of something as potent as datura, you'd expect certain physical symptoms alongside the mental ones, things like dilated pupils, rapid heartbeat, fever, dry mouth. And perhaps Rihanna's catatonic state might have presented differently.
So the overall medical picture didn't quite fit.
It seems not. Plus, there was no clear source identified. Did they accidentally eat it? Was it in their food? There was no obvious vector. So, combined with the lack of specific physical markers, investigators circled back to the purely psychological trigger. The belief was that the symptoms were driven by the mind, by the shared belief system, not by botany.
Okay, fair enough. Let's move to the theory that seems to align most closely with the family's specific actions. The tech and government paranoia angle. That act of destroying the phone, leaving all electronics, that feels very deliberate.
Absolutely. That highly specific shared commitment to ditching phones, cutting off cards, forcing Mitchell to throw his phone out the window, it powerfully reinforces the idea that the core fear, the central delusion, was deeply rooted in feeling tracked, watched, or surveilled.
It taps right into those wider anxieties that were definitely growing around 2016 and have only increased since, about technology, government oversight, losing personal privacy.
Exactly. It almost makes their delusion feel modern. They weren't fleeing demons in the traditional sense. They were fleeing metadata, GPS tracking, digital footprints.
For you listening, this is probably the most relatable or at least understandable aspect of their terror, isn't it? In a world utterly saturated by surveillance, capitalism, and data collection, the Trumps' flight, however extreme and detached from their reality, Became this kind of exaggerated, literal performance of the anxiety many people feel about losing control in the digital age.
It really did resonate on that level.
Okay, one more main theory bandied about: spiritual or apocalyptic belief. Did the sheer abruptness of it all, just dropping everything and driving, suggest some kind of sudden religious revelation or doomsday prediction?
Well, the total and utter abandonment of their normal lives, not packing clothes, not making arrangements, just driving it, certainly mirrors the behavior you might see in people who believe they've received some kind of sudden, extreme mandate, a divine command, maybe,
Or a warning, the end is nigh?
possibly. Whether it was a shared religious vision, a sudden conviction the apocalypse was imminent, or some other kind of cult-like spiritual revelation.
Yeah.
The sources really only treat this as pure speculation. There wasn't concrete evidence pointing this way.
Yeah.
However,
Yes.
in the clinical context of FME, it's actually quite common for the shared delusion to take on religious, grandiose, or even world-ending themes. It gives the delusion that critical sense of urgency. It justifies the extreme actions. So while speculative, it's not entirely out of character for the diagnosis itself.
So whichever theory you lean towards, or even if you stick with the official psychological one, this entire saga just gripped Australia. It earned that unforgettable, chilling nickname, Australia's strangest road trip.
It resonated so powerfully, I think, because it took this image of an ordinary, successful, maybe even aspirational family and showed them violent and publicly unraveling under pressures that were completely invisible to the outside world.
It became this disturbing mirror for a kind of collective anxiety, didn't it? The terrifying thought that even the most solid-seeming foundation can just crumble under internal, unseen forces.
And the sheer scale is hard to grasp. A 1,600-kilometer journey fueled by nothing but contagious fear. It's difficult to really conceptualize that level of shared disorientation driving people across state lines like that.
Let's pivot back then to the psychological reality, because, like you said, that's where the sources really offer the most solid insight. The prevailing conclusion is folia famille. We should probably spend a bit more time on the mechanics of how a delusion like this can actually take root and spread so intensely within a family.
Absolutely. We touched on it being rare, but why does it happen when it does? What are the conditions needed?
Right. You mentioned clinical prerequisites earlier. How did the Tromps' specific situation, their life, their family structure, meet those requirements for shared psychosis to develop?
Okay, so generally clinicians look for 3 key conditions coalescing. First, isolation.
Living on that secluded berry farm in Sylvan.
Exactly. It likely provided a highly isolated environment, maybe not physically cut off entirely, but socially and psychologically insulated. This minimizes external social contact, which means fewer reality checks, fewer dissenting voices or pieces of contrary evidence to challenge the inductors, likely Mark's emerging skewed view of reality.
So if they'd had neighbors popping over constantly or a busy social life, the shared reality might have been harder to maintain. The delusion couldn't incubate as easily.
Precisely. Isolation is a key factor. Second, you typically need a strong family hierarchy and intense interdependence.
Mark, the father, assumed to be the inductor, the head of the household.
Right. If the family unit is very close-knit, perhaps enmeshed, and heavily dependent on that inductor figure for psychological security, stability, maybe even identity, then the other members are far more susceptible to adopting his or her beliefs, no matter how outlandish they might seem to an outsider. The children, even as adults living and working on the farm, were likely still highly influenced by that parental structure.
Okay, isolation, hierarchy, interdependence was the third condition.
The third is usually a high state of underlying anxiety or stress. This provides the fertile ground, the psychological vulnerability, for the delusional seed to sprout and take root. And remember, the children themselves mentioned that buildup of generalized stress and pressure leading up to the break.
So when these 3 things align: the isolation cooker, the hierarchical pressure, and the fuel of ambient stress, the delusion from the primary person essentially faces no counterforce within the family unit.
And it spreads. Like a psychological contagion, it gets passed along those tight emotional bonds. And then, crucially, the road trip itself, the flight, became this relentless feedback loop, reinforcing the delusion.
Unpack that feedback loop for us. How did the actual actions they took, the frantic driving, the fear, being sleep deprived, how did that make the delusion stronger?
Well, think about it from their perspective. Their primary delusion, core belief, was we are being hunted, or we're in mortal danger. So every single action they took based on that belief, driving 1,600 kilometers nonstop, throwing away phones, abandoning their stable life, served as internal confirmation that the threat must be real.
Because why else would we be doing this?
Exactly. If you're running that far that desperately, you must be running from something truly terrifying. Add in sleep deprivation, sustained adrenaline. These things elevate suggestibility, they impair critical thinking and reasoning skills. Mark, Jacoba, Rihanna, and Ella were essentially trapped in a cycle, validating the shared narrative with every mile they drove. They were performing the role of terrified victims fleeing, which psychologically cemented the reality of the threat in their minds.
It's like method acting for a delusion.
In a way, yes, a very dangerous, uncontrolled form.
I want to circle back to that one bizarre anchoring detail we talked about. Ella, stealing a car, driving hundreds of kilometers back towards danger, just to feed her horses. What does that specific, almost absurd juxtaposition, the life and death crisis versus the mundane chore, what does that tell us about the state of their collective, or at least her mind at that moment?
It's a really important detail, I think, for understanding the fragmentation that can happen in psychosis. It suggests that while this abstract, maybe grandiose, large-scale delusion being tracked, being targeted for death, had hijacked the higher-level executive functions of the brain,
The planning, the reasoning.
some other, perhaps deeper, more fundamental structures remained partially functional. Maybe the caregiving instinct, the routine, the responsibility. She had clearly lost her grasp on societal reality, hence stealing a car, which is objectively wrong and risky. But she hadn't completely lost her grasp on her personal responsibilities, her connection to her animals.
It's like the mind trying to compartmentalize.
Possibly. Attempting to manage a profound, overwhelming crisis while desperately clinging to any shred of normalcy or purpose. However irrational the combination of actions might appear to us looking in from the outside, it's a tragic glimpse into a mind under unbearable strain.
So the powerful takeaway from the expert analysis is this. The family was never, as far as anyone can tell, in any external danger. No one was actually waiting to rob or kill them. But the internal reality they were collectively experiencing was so terrifying, so utterly convincing to them,
Yeah.
that it was powerful enough to propel them over 1,000 miles in a state of panic. It was a psychic wound that manifested as this desperate 1,600-kilometer multi-state flight. And that, for you listening, is the crucial point. The internal threat was just as real and just as devastating in its consequences as any external physical threat could possibly have been.
If we try to look at this case through a wider social lens, the Tromps flight in 2016, it almost feels prophetic now, doesn't it? Encapsulating these rising societal anxieties that have only gotten louder since then. Absolutely. The themes embedded in their specific paranoia, the fear of surveillance, the unease about financial stability, even if imagined in their case, the feeling of losing personal autonomy in this complex, digitally interconnected world. These are the very themes driving immense global anxiety today.
They didn't just abandon their phones. It was like this violent physical rejection of the digital era itself.
Exactly. And that's why the Trump story became this profoundly disturbing mirror for society. It forces us to confront that question. What happens when fear, particularly these modern technological paranoias, becomes the most contagious element within a closed group? What happens when it causes their shared perception of objective reality to completely fracture?
It's like a literal physical demonstration of what many people feel only metaphorically, that feeling of losing control, of being watched, of reality itself feeling unstable.
And we absolutely have to conclude this section by acknowledging the human cost. This wasn't just a weird news story. While thankfully, all the family members were eventually found physically safe,
The experience clearly left deep psychological scars. You had immediate psychiatric treatment needed for Mark, Jacoba, and Rihanna. Ella faced legal charges. The whole family went through an immense trauma.
immense. And notably, after the immediate crisis passed, after the recovery and Mark and Ella were cleared of any major charges related to their disorientation, the family largely withdrew from public life. They didn't give lengthy interviews, didn't write a book. They offered no comprehensive, detailed explanation beyond the official conclusion of a psychological break.
They asked for privacy.
They requested, and largely seemed to have been granted, total privacy, which is understandable. Their story remains this profoundly haunting study of human fragility. How quickly, how violently even the most seemingly grounded, successful lives can veer into surreal, chaotic territory when the mind or a collective of minds is put under acute, perhaps chronic, internal stress.
So, regardless of whether the Trumps fled actual external danger or pure, terrifying imagination, their story serves as this stark reminder, doesn't it? Just how incredibly thin that line can be between reason and acute shared fear.
And perhaps that the most persistent, most terrifying threats we face are often the ones manufactured inside our own heads, especially when those fears get amplified and validated by the people we trust the most. Hashtag outro. So to sum up, the Trump family journey. It remains officially concluded as a case of folia femi, a tragic, bizarre, but ultimately medically explainable event stemming from an internal psychological breakdown within that isolated family unit.
But that core conflict, the thing that keeps people talking about it years later, it still persists, doesn't it? Was it simply shared madness contained entirely within their minds? Or was it somehow catalyzed or triggered by something external, maybe a financial pressure cooker about to blow, maybe some environmental factor we don't know about, something so unusual that maybe no one has dared to fully name it? The why still feels incomplete to many.
What is certain, though, is the lasting impact on the family themselves. They have, as we said, repeatedly requested privacy. It highlights that their intense, surreal experience continues to leave scars, continues to affect them years later, long after the media attention faded and the hospital doors were closed. A profound personal trauma.
A sobering reminder behind the headlines. Thank you for walking us through that complex case.
Thank you.
Next time on Threads of Truth, we examine the mysterious disappearance of Jody Husentruth, the Iowa news anchor who vanished without a trace on her way to work back in 1995. Was it an obsessed fan, a stalker hiding in plain sight, or something far more calculated? Join us then.